Hi there and welcome to this, the last episode in Series 3 of the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. Great to have you here with us on the show. Now, for those of you who are new to the show, what is the show all about? Well, the show's all about raising awareness, influencing behaviour and fostering an organisational culture where information security and data protection are truly valued. Where did the idea from the show come from? Well, it's the spin out of 7.5 years of research that I've been doing as an information security professional, looking into the challenges of how we bring around demonstrable and effective changes in levels of awareness, changes in terms of behaviour, and also an understanding of how we change culture and how we need to consider culture and its implications on our efforts around awareness and behaviour. And as part of all that research that I've done, I was actually taken back in the early days by the breadth of disciplines, experience, skills, tools, which you didn't really find within the information security and data protection industries, which I felt could really contribute. And I felt this because actually, in effect, what I was doing was looking at how other people address the challenges of awareness, behaviour and culture. And let's face it, those challenges aren't unique to us within the information security and data protection industry. So, I spent a lot of time looking outside of the security and data protection industry, finding out how other people were addressing those challenges, both from an academic, but also really, really importantly, a practitioner perspective. And the podcast was a platform for bringing those insights to you, the listeners. So, who do we have on the show today? Well, back in 2014, InfoSec Europe invited me to sit on a panel of really distinguished guests. I felt a little bit out of place. We had 3 CISOs, one from one of the world's best known banks, one from one of the world's best known broadcasting organisations, and one from an organisation who was a core part of the UK's national infrastructure, critical national infrastructure. And then there was me in my role of heading up the Analogies projects and talking about why Analogy was such a strong tool for raising awareness and influencing behaviour. And I was referencing a lot in that panel the research I was doing through the Rethinking the Human Factor around behaviours and behavioural norms and how behaviours are formed, the role of culture, some of the challenges about how we were doing that currently in the industry. And this was back in 2014. But also the opportunities as I saw it. And one of the things I was referring to was something called nudge theory, and I actually had my red nudge book with me, which I waved when I was asked to recommend what people should take away from the event. But one of the CISOs, the CISO responsible for the critical national infrastructure organisation, really, really knocked me back because for all the research I'd done, all the people I'd spoken to, I'd never actually come across a CISO that was actually embracing the role of behavioural insights, behavioural management, basically designing with the human in mind, which is the thing which has been core to everything that I do. I've never ever come across somebody that was even talking about it. But this person wasn't just talking about it, they were actually implementing it in their strategy within the organisation they're in. So I was really taken back. Stayed in contact with them since. Every now and then we have there would have been an exchange of messages. But finally, I got him to agree to come on the show. So I kid you not, this is a really important interview because this person was one of the first CISOs I know who was actually incorporating behavioural insights into how they were designing their education awareness strategy. And secondly, has got real experience of putting this in place. And third, really importantly, it produced results. So without any further ado, let's get on with the interview. Hi, Andrew.
Oh, well, hi, Bruce. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. It's been one of those things where I've just constantly watched what you're up to. And then I was like, how do we finish this particular series 3 of the show? And I'm like, can we get Andrew onto the show? And I was like, yeah. So when I popped over that message to you and you responded, I was like, this is absolutely fantastic. It's going to be a really interesting chat.
I just love the topic. Honestly, I just love the topic. Any excuse to talk about it, I'll take it pretty much.
When you were grasping hold of it, when I do think about it, back in 2014, when I was talking about nudge on the stage, I shaped my nudge book with my notes in it. And so I'm talking about it from all that research that I'd done. And then I was like, my God, this guy's actually applying the lessons of behavioral science and insights and actually forming that into a strategy. And that for me is what I really want to get across to our listeners today. So do you want to just explain a little bit about who you are and your journey so far?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in security for many, many years, like many of us in the industry fell into it sort of by mistake and decided that actually I loved it. It was such a wide and interesting area. Became a CISO, lots of years ago in the legal sector. So I spent about 10 years in security leadership for some global law firms. And I just sort of finished a transformation program at one of the major law firms. And I was thinking about where to go next. And I didn't really have an idea of where I could go. I couldn't do another law firm. It would just be repeating the same old thing.
Yeah.
And I got the opportunity to move to Forrester Research. And so I moved to Forrester. And that was a really interesting step for me. It was very different from being a CISO. It gave me the ability to speak to lots of other security leaders around the world, to gather their ideas, to do research, and really have the ability to step back from the mayhem that is a CISO role, to actually have some thinking time and the privilege to sort of consider how things should be done. And I was covering the sort of CISO space and covering security awareness and strategy and budgets and all those sort of things for Forrester. But it was security awareness that I saw as one of the big topics. It was evident that security awareness was not working very well, that everyone was sort of doing it off the side of their desk and making best efforts to deliver. And it really wasn't having much impact. People were still talking about, well, everyone still clicks on phishing emails. People still download dodgy files and go to dodgy websites. In fact, one of the other Forrester analysts actually said that he thought security awareness was a complete waste of time and we shouldn't bother. We should just put all that money into technology to stop people doing the bad behaviors.
Oh, I've heard that.
And I couldn't countenance that. I couldn't be going with that idea. I believe in the human factor and that they could do something.
Yeah, absolutely. I have actually heard that a few times where it's sort of like giving up on the human and just putting your reliance completely on the technical control. And that, I think that says a lot about the culture of an organization or even an industry, that they can take that stance and lose faith in the human.
I don't know any organization that's actually implemented it, frankly.
Right.
I don't see how you can. There's always a human aspect to it. Even if you put in great controls, multiple levels of two-factor authentication, you're always going to get some person who thinks, oh, no, it would be easy. I'll just sort of stick them all together and put them on a web page and so I can access them all easily.
Yeah.
The human will find ways around any control that is inconvenient or awkward. So there's always a human factor. You can never remove that from the equation. You
moved to Forrester and you were just sort of explaining there that it was obviously you had the privilege, the luxury of being able to step back from doing the day-to-day CISO role, and you're able to sort of actually, what we would say, rethink the actual challenge of awareness. How did that materialize in terms of the rethinking, and what did it sort of bring to your mind in terms of fresh thoughts?
Well, it was an interesting piece of work, really, because I started to speak to lots of CISOs around the world about, okay, well, how do you do security awareness? How do you run your programs? And I sat back after having done all of those interviews and thought, no one's doing this properly. No one's doing a good job of this. No one's being effective and really transforming the culture of their organizations. And so I thought, okay, let's take a step back and think about what else could we do here? Who's good at this? Who changes people's behaviors? Who changes the way people think? And so at that point, I had to think, okay, let's go and speak to advertising agencies. Let's go and speak to other people outside of the security awareness box. And that's when I started to get some real interesting traction. Who better to advise me than somebody who makes me decide to buy that tin of peas rather than that tin of peas because of the coloring and the lettering and the placements on a shelf. That's what we want to learn from. How can we make people change the way they work in security? Through subtler means, not just by putting a video in front of them or putting a poster or a mouse mat with a logo on it. So it was through that I started to get introduced to some more interesting people with some more interesting and revolutionary for the security industry ideas. And that eventually led me to an introduction to a gentleman called BJ Fogg. And it was BJ Fogg that effectively was the aha moment in this. And we started talking to Professor BJ Fogg about the work he'd done at Facebook. Now he was involved at Facebook, and he helped them design the user interface to make people continually use Facebook and come back to it. And it was all about the simplicity of the interaction and the rewards you get from clicking to see the number of alerts you got. So we spoke to him and we discussed his model, his behavioral analysis model.
Yeah.
And I looked at it and thought, well, this could really work for security. And so we started bringing it back and applying it with a security lens on it, and it mapped really well. So at that point, that's when I started, my research really sort of came together. And I put together a model about the different aspects of behavioral science and how that could be applied in a security context. And that went down really well. And I did that paper, and I did lots of presentations and speeches about it. I then wrote a follow-up paper about measurement and how do you measure security culture, which perhaps we'll come on to later. But it was when I left Forrester that I decided that, okay, it's time to eat my own dog food now. and I moved to an organization where they didn't have a terribly mature security awareness program. And so it was time for me to put in place the model that I designed at Forrester, because nobody else was doing it. That was a really exciting piece of work. And I had some PwC consultants working for me who brought some fresh ideas as well. And together we put together a security awareness program across that organization, which eventually ended up winning a UK award for Best Security Awareness Program of the Year. But what was more fulfilling was not the award, it was the fact that it really was effective. And by the time I left that organization about 4 years later, the culture had completely changed. And cybersecurity was on everybody's lips, and everyone was thinking about it. Everyone cared, and everyone knew what to do. So it was really great to see that transformation over that period of time.
And it's interesting there, because when you were at Forrester, you did all that research, and then you mentioned obviously Forrester is talking about sharing research as well. So you used a phrase, it was like well received, but do you think it actually made a difference to people? Or was it so forward thinking, so ahead of the curve, that people just haven't got round to, taking these things on board? Because one of my personal experiences of the last maybe 4 or 5 years, it's that when I talk to people about applying behavioral insights and frameworks, etc., to the challenges around the human factor, it's either not on their horizon or their radar, or they're doing it in a very, very piecemeal way and not really driven by the science. So I'm just wondering, do you think that what you did at Forrester was really far ahead, and that still the industry is really struggling to adapt that sort of practice, that behavioral science-based practice?
It's a challenging question to answer, really, because I'm not sure whether this happens to all analysts, but you work through the logic, you come up with the model, and you sort of say, right, here's what we should be doing. And at that point, it just seems completely obvious. It doesn't feel like it's terribly far ahead. It just feels like, well, this is how people should be doing this. This is the logical conclusion to my research.
Yeah.
It's only when you look back and you go, hang on a second, I was talking about this, 8 years ago, and people are still only coming out with it now. And I was chatting to somebody in my current organization who looks after security awareness. And I walked her through my model and what we'd done at Forrester and what I'd done at my subsequent organization. And she said, I've just bought a book that says this. I was like, pardon? And she just bought a book that had just come out, in late 2019, which basically said the same messages.
Yeah.
And so although it didn't feel very cutting edge, I look back and go, well, perhaps it was. It doesn't feel particularly revolutionary, but perhaps it was ahead of its time. Perhaps it was some really good ideas that people could have adopted. If people are writing books about it in 2019, when we came out with this, 2014, 2015, it's perhaps it was quite ahead of its time. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I know based on my own research, it's similar. You look back now and talking about applying these things, you say, okay, yeah, I mean, what the sort of insights that you were sharing on that stage were, the fact that you were applying them for me was the big thing, because it's not unusual. People come up with great ideas and they've put it through theory, as an analyst, and you come up with that, this logically is how it should be applied. It's about actually, has it been applied, and has the person, the team that applied that really produced results? And I think that's one of the things I wanted to get all our listeners to be very aware of, is that you've done that and you've seen those results as a CISO. And I think, whether it's a CISO listening to this or an education awareness manager, I think it says, look, there's a conversation to be had about this, a serious conversation as well, that these insights actually could be really, really helpful in terms of forming more effective. And I think you mentioned that word earlier, effective education awareness programs. So, okay, right. So after Forrester, you then moved into this CISO role for that organization. And what would you say were the biggest challenges in terms of adapting the organization to the change that needed, the transformation that needed to happen? You've got a vision. They're at a certain point in maturity. What are the challenges around getting people to recognize and sign up to that vision, and then actually going about implementing it? What were the challenges for you?
Well, initially, it was sort of a reluctance to listen. The organization was part of critical national infrastructure, and it had a very different network structure than many organizations. So lots of the networks were logically and physically air-gapped away from the wider world for safety purposes. So I'd speak to engineers and they'd go, yeah, security is not an OT problem, not an operational technology problem, it's an IT problem. That's your issue. We're fine. We're behind firewalls. We're behind air gaps. Our networks are segregated. We don't need to worry about security too much. So that was, some of the initial conversations were like that. It was a journey to sort of say, actually, let me talk you through the consequences. Let me talk you through the issues. Let me talk you through the techniques that attackers use to try and make them realize that the consequences were real. And that then starts to bring them into sort of an understanding of, okay, yeah, there could be something here. And then take them through the motivation piece to get them motivated to actually learn about security. That was possibly the first sort of reactions I got in that area. Security was seen as important, but it wasn't seen anywhere near as important as safety. And safety was the paramount focus of that organization.
Right.
By the time I left, safety and security were on the same page pretty much everywhere. And they saw that one of the taglines we used was, how can you be safe if you're not secure? That cut to the heart of the matter when people really took to that. And so when I left several years ago, they were very much focused on safety and security being part of the same conversation.
When you mentioned the word consequences, was that sort of in the form of an understanding of the actual risk that a failure in awareness would bring about, or a failure in turning awareness to behavior? Because some people talk about consequences and go, well, we explain the threats and how this kind of happen. But, for me, it's like consequence, like risk assessment is to a certain degree about explaining the consequence to the organization should this happen. And that helps build the business case, surely.
Absolutely. So let me take a quick step back and just go through, for people who haven't seen what that model is, let me just give you a quick sort of 10,000 foot view of what the model is, because then you'll see how consequences fit in. Yeah. At the end of the day, the fundamental thing to remember here is that security awareness is not security behavior. Awareness and behavior are very different things. And I always use this analogy about smoking, that there's 100% awareness that smoking kills, and yet still thousands and thousands of people buy cigarettes and do that. Yeah. Awareness is not behavior, and we should break those two apart. So then you think, okay, well, what makes behavior? And the behavior can be broken down into three different aspects. This is how I've looked at it. One is motivation, one is ability, and one is trigger. And there's this really interesting thought experiment I often do when I'm talking about this topic, which is about answering the phone. And I think I used this on your analogy database. Yeah. This is a case of, imagine that your mobile phone rings, and you don't answer it. And list all the reasons why you might not answer it. Don't want to speak to that person, you're in the shower, it's an unknown number. Yep. You write down all the different reasons why you may not answer that phone. And then actually you can break them all down, and they all break down into those three things. You're not motivated enough, you don't have the ability, or you don't hear the trigger. And so you can look at behavior from those three aspects: motivation, ability, and trigger. Mm-hmm. And the consequences piece fits firmly under motivation. If people understand that actually the consequences for this organization could be catastrophic from you clicking on a link, they will go, okay, perhaps I'd better think about that. And in some security instances, we've taken away that consequence. So credit card fraud and things like that. Often people will have their details stolen, they'll be defrauded, and the bank will just give them their money back, and they'll be back, not even noticing that something had happened. Yeah. So there's no consequences there. So do people still take it seriously? Are they as careful as they can be with their credit card? Something to be discussed. Yeah. But we want to make sure that people understand the consequences, because when they do, they will act differently. Another analogy I use here is about thinking about walking along a plank. So if I put a plank in front of you on the floor and said, could you walk across that, Bruce? Just walk to the end of the plank and back again. Yeah. You would do that without hesitation. If I took that plank and put that plank 100 meters up in the air and said, Bruce, could you just walk one way and back again, please? Would you do the same thing? Or would you be like, hang on a second, Andrew, perhaps not this time? Because the consequences are different. Once you understand the potential consequences, your behavior changes, you think about things differently. And so it's important to make sure that the individuals understand the consequences to both the organization and to themselves of security breaches. That then changes their motivation. And there's different aspects to motivation as well in terms of the culture of the organization, the culture of the peers around them, and their current state of mind. But consequences is a fundamental piece of that.
Yeah. And I think it was really interesting. You mentioned there about things like the culture of the organization, the culture of the peers, the national culture. One of the things that's come through all my work around culture has been even, whether you're a grown up and you've trained within the legal profession or the accountancy profession or the marketing profession or the, technical IT professions, all these structures end up creating a culture, and actually that has a really significant impact upon the decisions that you make.
Absolutely.
And do we, as security professionals, education and awareness people, do we understand enough about the role of culture on decision making by the individual, or do we just see the context of culture within the overall challenge around the human factor as being one around culture within communication?
Interesting. And the reasons that culture jumped out to me, and it was many years ago, is I remember a PA coming to me, this is before my Forrester days, and saying that she knew that she wasn't meant to share her password, but all of her peers did, because that means they could support the other managers more easily. They all shared each other's accounts. And so she came to me and said, well, I've shared my password and I realize that's against policy and I shouldn't. And it's like, okay, that's a really clear example of peer pressure and the culture that's expected in the organization. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. And when we started to get into the measurement of security culture and what the key indicators were in terms of security, the one question you should ask was, does your manager care about security? That was the one really leading indicator. The people that said, yes, my manager cares about security, were much more likely themselves to care about security. Yeah. And so that's an indicator of the culture. If you feel that your manager believes in security, you tend to believe in security, and that shows the culture all the way down. So it's that culture piece is vitally important. And again, setting the right scene for people to make the right decisions.
And so that sort of supports the top-down argument, which I think everybody's sort of quite aware of that. It's the one thing that continually gets repeated, the mantra. But one of the things I did wonder is, because there are organizational cultures, but before your employees worked for you, they had possibly a minimum of 18 or 16 years of being submerged in the national culture, the family, all those things. And we had Gert-Jan Hofstede came on the show. He enjoyed it so much, he came on twice. and I'm sure he'd come on a third time again. But and he's he's well recognized around the whole issue of culture. And one of the things he was sort of highlighting is that a lot of the values which underpin the decisions that we make, the behaviors we have within an organization, are values which have actually been developed pre-work. And so sometimes when I look at the challenge of cultural thinking of culture within the context of information security within an organization, there's a natural inclination to look at organizational culture, but actually the people that come into the organization have brought cultural values with them, which can be very different in different countries. And I think it's interesting in these times of the virus situation, how different cultures are adapting or responding to the situation. One of the examples that I talked through with Gert-Jan Hofstede, but off the actual recording, was how we were looking at how in some cultures, people will respond directly to what's been from their line manager. They'll do exactly what it said, even if they want to challenge it. It's the case of culturally, it's you do what's been asked of you to do. In a different culture, in a different country, probably here in the UK, for example, or Western Europe or in North America, people are more inclined to actually challenge what the actual leadership is saying. So I guess the thing for me is you get this top-down mantra, this is how we do things, but actually a lot of the values which underpin decisions have come not from the top, even from that organization that they're brought in.
It's an interesting one, yeah. I think this relates then again to the peer pressure, the sideways pressure, the top-down messages, we have to do security. Yeah. But does that manager live that? Or do they just say that? Do they just sort of post you the link to the training the training scheme, and then leave you to read it. Or when it comes to the decisions that have to be made every day, do we do this? Do we go live with this project with this vulnerability in it? Do they live it? Do they actually make you think through the security issues? Do they have those conversations? I think that becomes very formant in the minds of the worker. Yeah. And then when you surround that by the peer pressure about, hang on, every one of my peers here, they all make the security decisions, the right security decisions. They don't cut corners. They don't go, oh, it'll be fine. And so they're much more likely to do the right thing at that point. But if you do have that culture of, we won't tell them about this one, we'll get away with this one, it'll be fine, then very quickly that individual, no matter what their background, they will sink to that level. Yeah. So it's about that peer pressure, that peer expectations. I think that's very formant for new people who join organizations. That's what they're looking for. Well, what does everybody else do? How can I fit in and be part of the team? How can I fit in and do what my manager wants? And so as long as they've got that initial pressure there, I think that can overcome quite a few years of, well, we do it slightly differently. Yep. I think the global cultural piece is perhaps a different challenge. And I'm not sure whether I've been fortunate or not, but since I've come out from Forrester, I've worked mainly for UK-based organizations. So I haven't had the challenges of the global stresses. But it's you do need to think that through. All the different ways of delivering the message can be very different depending on the culture that you're delivering it to. So you have to consider those aspects as well.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I did an interview recently with somebody responsible for education awareness program, but based in France, and they're from France originally, but they've worked in different places around the world. And they were saying how presenting the same content, same workshop in Germany and France, and actually the difference between how it was responded to. It's the same. It was the same content with the same objectives, with the same type of line managers, but they recognized, they were like, the response from Germany was different to the response from France. And they came to, when they thought it through, they were like, actually, this is coming down to these cultural values, which are probably more associated with sort of, I guess, the Germanic type of cultures compared to the Latin type of cultures that you would get in France and Italy and Spain, for example. And he had that moment and he's taken it away. He said, it's only a small thing. He said, but actually, the impact on the effectiveness of the workshop was really quite significant.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. If you're like, we're talking about those marginal opportunities for improving the things that we're currently doing, for example, it's like, understanding those cultural nuances might be one of those marginal opportunities for improvement. In this case, in that particular gentleman's case, it was in terms of the workshop he was delivering. So yeah.
I think you're right. There's marginal opportunities for improvement, but actually, I think for a lot of organisations out there, it's not the marginal improvements that they can achieve. They can actually achieve big steps forward just by thinking about this differently. Yeah. Too many people still have that awareness. Security awareness is my answer. They still have that focus in mind rather than behavioural change. So awareness is only part of the solution.
It's only part of the solution.
You need to think the bigger picture through, and if you don't think through that motivation, if you don't think through the ability of people to actually to meet their behavioural requirements, and think through the triggers that are going to remind them and guide them in the right way, you're going to miss. You're going to have a security awareness program that meets the awareness goals, but actually doesn't have a great impact on your organisation.
Behaviour. Can I just ask a question? When you're doing that research and you're having those conversations with PJ Fogg, and he was talking about how behaviors are formed and influenced, and then in how you design the interface between the user and Facebook. How important is the design element of security and integrating behavior in this? Because for me, it's a missing part of the equation. A lot of people, when they talk about education awareness, there's like computer-based training, induction, comms campaigns, and these are all part of the overall solution. But one thing is that I've always believed in is, if you design a bad product, don't expect people to sort of buy it. Or the phrase I use is like, if security was a product, would you buy it? And if you bought it, would you buy it again?
Yeah.
And this is the whole thing about ads, marketing, etc. So I'm just wondering, when you had that conversation with BJ Fogg, did the importance of incorporating behavioral understanding and insight in how you design the product. Was that something that was really important?
Honestly, not really. That didn't really come out in the conversation I had with him. I think I was probably focusing more on some more fundamental issues than that. It did come out in the later thinking around this, though. And we started to think about being very proactive in designing the behavior you want. Because again, with awareness, we just stick down several principles. Don't click on a link. Tell us about if you see anything suspicious. And then we walk away. We don't really define what the new behavior should look like. So there's certainly the concept of designing the behavior you want and then pushing that delivery to make that happen. But then also thinking about the designing of the content that will take people through that journey. And people have got very sophisticated tastes these days. They're used to having very Hollywood values, as we called it in Forrester. They're used to seeing very high value videos. They're used to seeing very slick user interfaces. They get that from pretty much every app they download onto their iPhone or iPad.
Yeah.
And what do we do in security? We'll print a mouse mat or print a poster and stick it on the wall and we'll walk away. And people will just turn their nose up at that. So you need to think about how you can create a good design for the content that will actually be eye-catching and engaging. And people will feel is sophisticated enough for their current tastes. And certainly in the organization where we implemented this the first time, we did use an external design agency to bring us a brand about security awareness that we could stand behind. And we got ourselves the logos, we got ourselves the catch lines, we got ourselves a very different brand than the organization. We had to go to our internal comms people and say, our corporate colors are this. We're going to go a different way and use this because we're trying to get a different message across. We want to stand out. We want to be different. We're going to bring in certain elements of the brand, but we're going to just change other bits. And they were a little reluctant to start with, but they agreed with us. And eventually it proved to be very powerful because we had this different color scheme, this different way of communicating. It stood out and people paid attention to the content that we put up because it looked so different, yet still had the rings of familiarity about it. So you have to think about those high production values and how you can bring that to the table. Just creating a PowerPoint slide yourself and printing that out and putting it on a wall is really, it's probably not going to work. You have to think about the bigger design of the message and the content.
No, I think it's really important because one of the things that I'm sure a lot of listeners will come across is when they're trying to design something from an internal comms perspective, the natural thing is you speak to internal comms as a significant stakeholder in the whole process, and then they say, well, here's the guidelines. And there's part of you is tempted to, we don't want to rock the boat. These are the guidelines. They're there for a purpose. There's another part of you which is like, somebody's made my job easier by giving me the guidelines. I'm sort of inclined to agree with you that you need to present your case to internal comms. This is like, well, there is a risk that if we use the guidelines, we just blend in amongst all the other messaging. And that means that we won't be able to achieve our objectives of A, B, and C, which then means that our risk exposure increases, in effect. So when you had that conversation, how did you win them over and sort of get them on your side? Because I think a lot of the listeners will be like, this is a problem I come across. The internal comms just won't let me do anything unique.
Yeah, it was a challenge. I don't deny that. They didn't want us to go off piste and start doing our own thing, but we did maintain the majority of the brand, the key items of the brand. We had this specific logo that the company used, and we maintained that. But what we did is we changed the background color. That was the major color. And then we had our own font that we used for the messaging. And they weren't keen, but we had to say that this is why we're doing this. We're doing this to create an alternative message, to create an alternative way that people will pay attention to this. Yep. This message is so important. It has the backing of the exec and the CEO. We need to communicate this to our staff and we need them to pay attention. If we just put up another poster that looks like every other poster, it will not have the impact. And so changing that whole design is about changing the impact and changing the attention this will get. And they were fine with that. They were good with that. Eventually, they changed their minds despite being reluctant. What's interesting to see, actually, is by the time I left, let's see, many people had followed our design changes. So actually, It probably was, but it made actually our messages would be becoming a bit more like everybody else's because everyone was moving to our design choice. So I guess if I'd stayed there a little longer, we might have wanted to pivot again and change away and do something slightly differently.
And that is the lesson. That is the key point here. This is a continual process of improvement.
Absolutely.
And so the idea that, you come up with a brand and you just stick to that brand, okay, for the next however long, just keeps going and going. Where you do something and it becomes seen as success, other people then adapt or adopt that internally, potentially. We've seen this with a couple of organizations ourselves. And then suddenly the objective of standing out is lost because everybody else is doing it. So then it's about what is your management process for continually reviewing the effectiveness of what you're doing to then identify, hold on here, we've been a victim of our own success. And actually now everybody's following us, which means that we're no longer standing out, which was the original objective. So now we need to go through a process of rebranding.
Yeah.
Refreshing the brand. And I think that's a really important lesson for everybody. Things aren't done. You don't tick them off and then think, okay, that's done. Then it's a case of it's done. Okay, but what's my process for then measuring it? Okay, and then see whether or not it's being effective, which I guess brings me to something, which is the metrics piece, which I know is something that's important to me. Talk about, you did that metrics white paper back at Forrester. What did you garner from that?
Well, again, it was a case that everybody who was doing metrics regarding security awareness were using pretty much two measuring points. And that was how many people have taken the security awareness exam and how many people clicked on a phishing link this month.
Yeah.
And that was it. Those are the only two metrics anybody ever really used.
Yeah.
They'd use other things like how many laptops did we lose this month? Or they'd measure incidents and, okay, how many people broke the rules and did something silly? How many infections did we have on PCs? And I always looked at that and thought, this strikes me as a little unfair, especially when you understand the model behind all this. Motivation, one of the aspects of motivation is the state of somebody. If they're in a very stressed or busy state of mind, they're likely to make more mistakes. They'll click on a link because they just weren't thinking because they just got 200 emails to get through. And I always thought it was relatively unfair to just identify all the things that went wrong. Identify just the lost laptops, just the people who clicked on links, and then just put all your metrics around those failures. So we looked to see what we could do to create a more holistic metric and measurement model. And actually, the aspects in the model that we've got works really well. Motivation and ability. Those are the two major aspects. The trigger is there as well to remind people to do the right thing, to guide them on the right path. But motivation and ability are the key aspects of this. So what we did is we started to just chart those. And so we went out and did an annual questionnaire together with the safety team. And we used to get very high percentage return rate from our organization. And we started to put security questions in there. And from those security questions, each one was linked back to, okay, is this question about ability? Is this question about motivation? Is this about their understanding of consequences? Is this about the awareness of the expected behavior or the recognition of the threat? And we'd map all the questions back to motivation and ability. And then we mapped that to the different teams. So at the end of that questionnaire, we had a chart which showed where HR was and where IT were and where marketing were in terms of both motivation and ability, charted on a graph. And so we could start to understand then where the organization sat in terms of motivation and ability. And if we found a team that was very motivated but had low ability scores, we knew that next time we spoke to them, we had to talk about ability. We had to focus on the ability aspects. And the same if the opposite was true, if they had the ability but weren't motivated, we knew that next time we spoke to them, it was all about the motivation, consequences, culture, and that could drive them forward. And so we did that over several years, and you could see those questions, the answers driving towards that top right, where people were getting better at motivation, getting better with ability. And so we weren't just measuring incidents and problems anymore. We were measuring the likelihood of people to do the right thing. So, being top right means you've got all the motivation, all the ability, and you're given a security decision to make, you're much more likely to make that right decision. And so that was how we started to measure the culture. And it was, again, really effective, and it could show continual improvements each year So the exec were happy to reinvest in the program on the basis that my metrics were showing an improving situation each year.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I completely concur with you on, what metrics tend to be used by people. They tend to be around where things go wrong. And don't get me wrong, there is some value to that. But actually, from a behavioral perspective, what people respond most effectively to is the positive stuff, where things are going right. So if you can shape your metrics to reflect that positive piece, people are more inclined to get drawn towards it. And I think, the point about the exec seeing that things were moving forward, and therefore the more inclined to support other initiatives that you have to maintain that momentum is much more likely. It's much more likely to happen. Whereas if you're constantly talking about the negative, and I, on a personal level, I think reporting on the number of people that clicked on the phishing link to the exec is really the detail. It's too much. It's too granular.
That's an interesting one, because we still do that in my current organization. That's very much a metric we use, and we do encourage a little bit of competition, shall we say, between departments by publishing back to them their phishing statistics about how many of them in the team clicked in this month. And they all always look at the corporate security department and go, well, have we got a better or worse click rate than corporate security? So we're always the target level. But that's fine. We're good with that. We do have both carrot and stick associated with the phishing stats that we use in my current organization. So if you're seen as if you click on the phishing test links that are sent out and regularly click on those, then that will be escalated to your line manager and then to your local exec manager. So people will have conversations with you saying, you've clicked on a phishing link again, and trying to correct those behaviors. Again, putting some consequences to it. Yeah. But there's also the carrot as well. If you're seen as somebody who actually correctly reports phishing links on a regular basis, then actually the more successful people who report these can get a financial bonus over the course of a month or a year, depending on how many phishing alerts they've correctly identified and reported. So they can get up to $1,000 reward for being a good reporter of phishing attempts. So there's both carrot and stick associated with that, and that helps. We do find that the click rates in my current organization are pretty good.
And I do think that just to clarify, it's almost like, what you're doing around phishing is something that I would agree with. I just think there's different metrics at different points in the organization, and you can have metrics across departments. For example, I've definitely seen this. I've definitely supported it. The idea of competitiveness across the departments. But it's an interesting one when you look at multinational organizations, the different way that different cultures respond to the concept of competitiveness between each other, and how it can actually have an impact upon education and awareness. So in some places, it's all about the massive team, everybody. Yeah. In some cultures, where in other cultures it can be quite competitive. It's about trying to beat the department next door or whatever. Even internally there's a bit of a rub between two different departments because they're just constantly niggling it at each other. Yeah, you get it in the armed forces. I know in the United Kingdom, the parachute regiment always seems to have an issue with the Marines. And the Marines always have an issue with the paras. But they're still part of the same unit. But there's an element of, it's identity. In that case, it was like the identity. One thing, they're better than the other, but it's mainly jokingly. But there's something to it culturally.
It is. I think, however, in a corporate land, I'm not sure it works like that. Because I see that competitive element being there, and it's not a huge aspect of it at all. It's relatively small, but it's at the managerial level. It's the top level person who owns that team, that function. They're the one who looks at it and goes, where am I on the chart? Where's my team's on the chart? I don't think it cascades all the way down to the individuals. I don't think it needs to. But there's an element of, again, does my manager care about security? There's another little aspect of that. They do, because they'll look at the scores and go, hang on a second, what do I need to do not to be last next month? Yeah. And I've always found that works quite well in encouraging different behaviors. You start to put them on a chart and someone will come to you and go, I was last this month. How can I not be last next month? And that will help people, not necessarily about security awareness, but any topic. That'll start to drive that.
Yeah, I think what the initial one was about, so if you've got 10 departments, there's reporting on the top 9.
That's an interesting way of doing it.
And somebody looks at that, and they look, and they're double checking. The department's going, I'm not on there. I'm on there. That's for a reason.
That's a really good idea. I like that concept. I mean, there's other things in terms of measurement as well. I think one of the things that people should think about, it's more about engagement as well, is gamification. One of the things we started to do in the organization was bring in sort of tactical gamification. Now, many people talk about gamification and they talk about it very strategically. It's like, well, people will have a score and they will keep that score for years, and it'll prove that they're really engaged in security, and that's fine. But oh my God, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it's a big commitment to keep on producing content that can keep that whole strategic gamification going. And this got shown to me by my wife. We got a car, and the car had miles per gallon right in the middle of the dashboard, so you couldn't miss it. And she changed her way of driving to max it out, and so she was much softer on the accelerator, softer on the brakes, and the miles per gallon went up and up and up and up, and then it topped out and it couldn't go any further, and so she basically just went back to the way she drove previously, and it hadn't really changed her behavior. She was just playing the game of maxing out that score. And I see that's true in gamification as well. If you're not continually challenging people and continually putting new content in front of them, then they'll just zone out of gamification and you'll just lose them. So I think strategic gamification is an interesting concept, but it's a big commitment. You have to think carefully before you go into it. So we did more tactical gamification, just introducing workshops that were fun and entertaining, but had serious security messages in them. They worked really, really well. And you could just see the appetite, because every time we posted a new one up and said it was available, we get inundated with requests to do these. So that was really, really good, and a great way to get those messages across.
Yeah. I mean, gamification, and I think it's really important to highlight that difference there. Gamification is a buzz phrase that is very widely used throughout the education and awareness industry sector. Everyone's doing gamification, but there's tactical work things that you can do, and there's a strategic approach. I completely agree with you. If you can get the investment, the business case together for a strategic approach, which obviously will then incorporate how you do things tactically as well, absolutely fantastic. But that does require, producing quite a lot of content, and also content that makes sense. Producing content for content's sake is not actually a particularly effective strategy. Content with clear objectives in mind, which means they've got to be aligned to your actual strategy, which I often don't believe organizations have got the time. They've actually documented what their education awareness strategy is. They tend to do things on a year-by-year basis. And they say, well, what's your 3-year, 5-year plan on this? If you don't have those objectives, then you just produce content. Yeah. And so I think you do have to be clear. If you get the investment for a strategic view, or look at doing things tactically, but obviously measure them for success, and where it's working, focus upon that, and then raise awareness of the success of the project, because it draws both investment and also it draws other people who haven't necessarily engaged to say, what is it everyone else is doing? Oh, right. And they're drawn to the activity that you've created, the workshop. So yeah, I could agree with you with that. Can I just bring us back to, when you talked about your model, motivation, then ability and trigger, the ability piece, is that just that's the education piece, I assume? Well,
it's some of that. So certainly within the ability, there's probably 3 main aspects to it. One is, can people recognize the threat? So do they recognize when they're in danger? Do they recognize when a certain behavior should be brought to the fore? And then do they know what to do in that position? What is the expected behavior? What do I do if I lose my laptop or if I click on a phishing link? So those 2 are the bits that you would probably recognize as traditional security awareness. But then you also have to think about what we expect them to do next. It's the simplicity of what that behavior is. Think about if you had to report a phishing email. So we want people to report phishing emails. Great. Okay. So how do they do that? Do they just click on a button in the browser, or do they have to phone the help desk, wait 10, 15 minutes in a help desk queue, then get through and talk it all through with the help desk person? I think you can guess pretty much which one of those is going to be most effective. Yep. It's the simplicity of the behavior we need to think through as well. People will always find the path of least resistance. They will always go for the simple, easier behavior. So you need to make sure that the secure thing is also the easy thing. It's the simple thing. If you actually put complexities and barriers in front of them, then people will deviate away from the behavior that you want. And you'll have yourself to blame, really. So that's in there too. That's in the ability aspect. And that's one thing that perhaps people don't think about too much.
Yeah, and from a behavioural perspective, you would see that people are drawn to the easy option. I think one of the things from my own research was understanding why that happened. When you come to understand, well, I often, when I talk to people, I want to say, do you understand what it means to be human? And people sort of talk about things. I say, do you understand what physically it means to? What is the physical makeup of the person whose decision you're trying to influence? And when you understand the physical side of it and how that actually connects to the decision-making process we go through using the brain, for example, you then start to understand, at times like this, when somebody is tired, under stress, et cetera, they're more inclined to use this side of the brain, where these biases and heuristics lie. And those biases and heuristics are basically telling, use the easy option, take the easy option.
Yeah.
And I've done a presentation on this for the ISF, and it went down so well, the connecting what's physically going on with your conscious decision making. And when you start to understand the connection between the two, you start to go, yeah. So that's why we need to make it as easy as possible when we do training, or how we design when they're reporting, we ask them to report, click on this button, or go through all this palaver of, bringing a number, depending on what region of the world you're in, being on hold, possibly I remember speaking to one client when I went through their reporting process. You rang a number, then you were given 3 choices, and you're like, oh, this is already too difficult. I've got to choose between 3 things. And you're like, yeah. And we actually sat down with them afterwards. We said, I think we've got the solution to the problem. And they said, well, so we said, your whole reporting process, it's way too convoluted. And we actually look at the number of people that were calling the first number, and then we looked at the drop-off rate.
Yeah.
All right. That tells you everything. You've got people that are willingly calling the number, but then after that, they're all dropping. They were, not all of them, but it was a very high percentage where people were dropping off. You're like, what does that mean to those people? They've gone out of their way to report the incident.
Yep.
Okay. And then their whole experience has been a really, really bad, a poor experience. So how likely are they to do it again the next time?
Exactly. I mean, what does that say to them? That says that actually we don't really care. We don't really care because we're happy for you to try and phone us and then not get through, and we won't follow up on that. So it suggests then that the culture of the organization, which may say security first and let's be secure, it isn't all the way through. It's just a logo. It's just a catchphrase. If you don't have those channels to allow people to follow the right behavior and make it easy for them, then the whole thing falls apart. So you do need to think about that aspect. I love the concept of the physical piece as well. I'm going to do some more reading. I'm going to find your presentation on that. It comes home to me because actually I had a really long day yesterday. And I think I looked at an email I sent at about 9:30, 10 o'clock last night. And the language in it just didn't sound like me. It's just like, this isn't an email I would normally send. It sounds more emotional than me. It doesn't sound as sort of logical and fact-based as I would normally send. It's like, it's probably just the fatigue of the day making me use a different side of my brain because my normal logical side of the brain is just tuckered. So then perhaps I've just started to rely on a more emotional side to write this email late at night. Interesting.
Well, when I kicked off my research program like 7.5 years ago, that's where I actually started. The whole thing started off by, I realized that I didn't really know a great deal about what it means to be human on a physical level.
Interesting.
And
I'll have to go back and do some research into your stuff that you've created. Then that'll be interesting reading for me.
Yeah, it was an absolute. Suddenly, a lot of the behaviours that we see around non-compliance with policies, process, and procedures started to make a different type of something. A lot of us would say, "Oh, that's for this reasons," and there was a degree of understanding of that. But it's like actually starting to understand the science behind it. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, as soon as I came to understanding the science, I'm like, and that's why hackers design, that's how they create their campaigns, their attack strategies. And for me, I was like, that's how I would design it. because now I design with the human in mind. And this is, I think, the thing for me is if hackers design with an understanding of people, how decisions are formed and influence, the role of culture. We had an episode with Charles Sample, who's been doing some really interesting research around how the correlation between attack methodologies and cultural values of the countries where the people are being targeted, and they're seeing similarities between them. So when you start to understand that, you're like, actually now, if I understand that, I can then take that and say, well, how can I apply that to how I design my education and awareness strategy?
I did a presentation recently with a big security vendor who works in the email security space, and they do a lot of work in that sort of space. They look at the attack maps that the hackers are using, and rather than putting up big network diagrams anymore, they start with the people diagrams. Okay, who are the people I need to attack? What information have I got about them? How can I best leverage what I know about these people online to make a very clickable link that I can send to them? Where can I take them that they will go for? And it's very interesting to see that the shift from being network focused to being people focused in the attack vectors. And so we do need to focus even more on people to make sure they're aware of what they should be doing and where they shouldn't be leaking information out about the systems they work on or the roles they've got or the system privileges they may have. It's all the more important now to get those education pieces through to people to protect them not only in their business lives, but in their personal lives. Yeah. Because the two, as we all know, have blurred over the past years. And so people now have LinkedIn profiles that may actually be very useful to an attacker, which gives them an idea about, well, they work on this system with these privileges using this technology. Okay, that's something I can now leverage.
And I think with that in mind, I'm going to bring this to an end. I think it's a perfect way to finish this absolutely fantastic conversation, Andrew. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show and sharing your thoughts. Really, really interesting. I'm sure that all the listeners would really have enjoyed that.
Super. No, it's been my pleasure. I'd love talking through this topic, as I mentioned. So anytime that I can come back and help at all in the future, feel free. Just reach out.
Hi there, and I hope you found that conversation we just had with Andrew Rose really interesting. Back in 2014, he really did make an impression upon me because by then, 2014, I'd done 3.5 years worth of research into the human factor, and that involved a lot of conversations with people. At one point, we actually ran a series of workshops in New York, Barcelona, in the UK, and we interviewed a couple of hundred information security data protection leaders, and it was really, really clear right then that people were not really incorporating an understanding of awareness and behavior specifically and culture into how they were designing their strategy to address these challenges around the human factor. And so and that was partly what motivated me to really, really press forward with my research and to try and bring some ideas, structure to the market. So when I met Andrew on the stage at InfoSec 2014, and he illustrated how he had brought in this behavioral specialist who had been working with Facebook and how he'd sort of come to understand how behaviors were formed and influenced, I was really pushed back. Because for me, if you really want to influence behavior, you've got to really understand how behaviors are formed and influenced. And here I had a CISO on the stage talking about both an understanding of it from an academic theory perspective, but really importantly, somebody who'd then taken away some of those nuggets and actually put it into place. So really, really great to have him on the show, because I think what it should do for all our listeners is give you a sense of confidence that whilst people like me will often talk about it from a theory perspective, though, to be fair, I have actually applied it in a number of organizations. What you've got are CISOs like Andrew who are responsible for information security within really big organizations who are actually going about implementing this. And they should give you confidence that there's a story for you to take to your CISO, or if you are a CISO, to take to your board and say, hey, this stuff is making a difference. And then, get on with the job of actually implementing it. Okay? So hopefully that's given you the confidence. If you found those type of insights from Andrew that Andrew and I discussed today interesting, if you're like, okay, I've listened to some of the other episodes and actually, there's this here and that, there and that there, and you're like, okay, this is all really, really interesting. How do I go about applying it to my specific situation? Well, the good news is after 7.5 years of research and actually applying all my research into a number of organizations around the world, I can help you specifically with that challenge. So I help people through my face-to-face training and workshops, but also we're about to launch our online training courses as well. And the other thing I do is group coaching and also individual coaching and mentoring for CISOs, education awareness managers, and security professionals who have been given the challenge of awareness, behavior, and culture. If you'd like to know more about that type of thing, if you think, okay, how could Bruce help me specifically? Best way to find out more is to drop me an email. And you can do that at bruce.hallas, HALLAS for sugar, at re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. Let me just repeat that for you. Bruce.hallas at re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. Please drop us an email. I'd love to hear about what your challenges are and see whether or not I can be of some support to you in terms of pushing those challenges aside and making real, demonstrable and effective progress around the challenges of the human factor within information security and data protection. So normally at this point, we talk about who is next on the show. Well, the news is just to remind you that this is the last episode in the third series. And so we're actually looking forward to having a short but very, very welcome break. So we won't be back for another 4 or 5 weeks, but we have got Series 4 planned. We've got some truly amazing guests on Series 4. We have tried to build upon the success of how we've sort of built the podcast to date. We're going to be taking some really interesting angles, actually, looking at awareness, behavior, and culture, the human factor, from a slightly different angle as a result of what's been going on in terms of the public health challenges that the world has been facing this year in 2020. So we're going to bring some really, really different angles on those challenges. And so it'd be absolutely fantastic if you could join us on the show. We're going to have some great guests from outside of the information security community, data protection community. We're going to have some great guests in terms of listeners that are actually applying what they're learning from the show and then talking about their own experience. And we're going to have some great people from within information security and data protection who are people that can talk to us about the challenges of awareness, behavior, and culture from their own experience and how they've been able to overcome them. So in the meantime, please do stay safe. Please do stay at home if that's what you're supposed to be doing. Take the opportunity to maybe, listen through some of our own podcasts and other podcasts. One thing I always recommend, listen to podcasts, read books which don't relate to information security and data protection. Really, really important. I think one of the key things that I've learned from my research is that actually challenges of awareness, behavior, and culture are not unique to cyber and data protection. And I think most of my thinking, most of my innovative thinking, most of my inspiration and creativity comes from reading outside the industry. So yeah, watch out for LinkedIn, by the way, because we're going to be running 25 videos, letting you know what are the books which have been really quite formative in my own research over the last 7.5 years. So please take care of yourselves, take care of your families, and it would be lovely to have you join us back on the show in 4 or 5 weeks' time for Series 4 of the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast. Many thanks.